Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We are coming to you via recording. We're putting the presentations together for considerations for selecting pedestrian hybrid beacon locations. We're putting those into a recording and sharing them out to you so we could bypass some of the technical problems that we experienced during yesterday's webinar. We collected a few questions to provide a bit of discussion, so we'll try to incorporate that today, but we may also be posting some responses to the questions on our website. So later in the broadcast, you should know that I'm going to provide some information at the very end about how you can get your certificate of attendance for this session. So once you've gone through the whole thing, you'll be able to find that information. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our first set of presentations. And as I do that, let me remind you who these folks are. So Bill Stone joining us, who will be kicking off this presentation. Bill is a senior research project manager with the Arizona DOT, and he's been in this position since December 2018. Previously, he worked for the Missouri DOT, which included 12 years experience as a research administrator of the research section. Bill also has experience in bridge design and inspection, traffic studies, and planning, all during his 34-year career at Missouri. We've also, during this presentation, have joining us Mike Cynecki, who is a project manager with Lee Engineering's Phoenix office. And he has over 40 years of experience in traffic operations and safety. Mike spent 26 years in the Street Transportation Department, where he oversaw the installation of the first 9 pedestrian hybrid beacons in Phoenix and the first 2 rectangular rapid flashing beacons in Arizona. So Mike, you're all set up. Bill, please go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Very good. I appreciate the opportunity to present some of the work that we're doing in Arizona. I'll be talking about a research study relating to pedestrian hybrid beacons. Mike and I are working together on this. We've presented this before, and Mike Cynecki was one of the key research team members. So Mike, could you go to the next slide, please? We thought we would start by giving an indication or giving some information on what is a pedestrian hybrid beacon. We felt that with a large number of people, there's interest, but maybe some people hadn't actually seen one or seen some of the information on them. So we provided a picture of a PHB that happens to be in Tucson, Arizona, to give you an indication, an understanding that a pedestrian hybrid beacon is a traffic control device, but it provides a stop condition for the vehicular traffic so that pedestrians can cross. As you'll see here, this one happens to be in an intersection location. We have a pedestrian making the crossing in the crosswalk, but it gives you an opportunity to see the difference between a pedestrian hybrid beacon and a traditional traffic signal. So we just thought we would show that. You'll see there it says formerly Hawk. That was the original name that was tagged to this device. And Hawk actually stands for High Intensity Activated Crosswalk. So we had to have an acronym for it. They were introduced in 2000, and really they were in an experimental mode for many years. All the way up till 2009, when they were included in the revision to the MUTCD, the Manual for Uniform Traffic Control Devices. We also felt we would show to the right there on the slide, you'll see the different indications, and kind of basically wanted to show what the different indications are on the traffic device, and then what the pedestrian would see at those different types, different phases of the signal. So just to give a little bit of background, and again, Mike will talk a little bit more obviously about the operation of it as we get into the presentation, and more of those details, a little bit more on the history of it. Next slide, please, Mike. But again, I wanted to give a little bit of background of why we decided to do this research project and frame some of the things we're looking for when we started it. The Arizona DOT did develop PHB guidelines in 2012. We also have a AZ STEP supplement So that provides a little bit more local information that, of course, supports the FHWA AZ step, but does provide a little bit more of a local detail in some areas. But we were interested, we had seen some of the national research that reported the effectiveness of PHBs in reducing crashes, injuries, and fatalities. But we also felt that we needed to have a more Arizona-specific state data evaluation, looking at the effectiveness of the PHBs and quantifying that on a safety and operational aspect in Arizona. And that was really what we wanted to do. And again, one of the things that we felt was important was using some of the similar methodology that the national research had so that we could assist in the effort of providing more data, validating the PHBs and seeing how they compared and if they were similar to some of the national findings. Next slide, please. So again, looking at the objectives, obviously the first and foremost was seeing how do they reduce the severity of ped and bike collisions, crashes. We wanted to do that again with specific Arizona data. And also, what is the compliance with the PHBs? When the ped or bicyclist comes up to the PHB, are they pushing the button? How are they reacting? And when do they start their crossing in relation to traffic? So Michael talked about the 10 locations that were identified, 10 different locations of the PHBs that were used for some field work in evaluating things such as that bike ped compliance. Now, one of the keys, of course, was we were also very interested in looking at what are the, and as it shows here, what are the characteristics for optimal placement. And what we really wanted to find out there is what is the geometry needed in relation to maybe a traffic signal that's down the road. How far away should a PHB, what should be the, the minimum distance that they can be placed, and those type of things. Obviously, geometrics specific to the PHB, but one of the keys, of course, we were looking at what are the miles per hour? What is the speed that it is still appropriate to use a PHB? At the time, we had a 45 mile per hour allowance, so we were placing that in those locations. Mike will show you the 10 locations and what their posted speeds are, and ultimately looking to review and enhance our existing PHB guidelines. Next slide, please. And looking at the driver behaviors, first and foremost, we wanted to see the percent of drivers yielding to pedestrians. And looking at in particular, of course, the drivers not stopping during the all red, steady red indication. So that was one of the key ones. The other also, though, as you saw in those indications on that first slide, there is also a flashing red phase. So we wanted to also take a look at what maybe a vehicle in the queue that's the second or third vehicle back, once the signal goes to flashing, how are they reacting to it? How are drivers reacting to a flashing red when they come up to the device? And then look at the number of drivers on the cross streets. As you saw in that slide, the opening slide there, on the main street is where the device will be, but how are the drivers on those cross streets at an intersection? How are they reacting to the PHB? So lastly, I'll talk about the next slide. We'll talk about the pedestrian behaviors. So I briefly mentioned the pedestrian using the push button. So during the field study, we had video out there at those 10 locations, and we were evaluating how the pedestrians reacted when they came up to the traffic signal, to the PHB. And for example, if someone came to the PHB and there's no traffic, are they pushing the button? If they come up to the device and there's already someone on the other side, there were times where nobody pushed the button, but maybe that second pedestrian assumed that the first one had. So some of those, and Mike will talk about those numbers. and the percent crossing during the PHB phase. What was the PHB display once they began their crossing? That was another one of the scenarios that we evaluated. And just looking at other behaviors that were observed at the PHBs. Next slide. So here's, to start with, here's a picture of another device. As you see it, it's one that was at a fairly narrow raised median, but it's not on a mast arm, it's on a post. So I just wanted to show a picture of a different type of device. And again, this is a wider street, more lanes, etc. So there's many times, obviously, that this is how it will be constructed. So ultimately, I just wanted to turn it over to Mike. Again, the Arizona DOT, we had contracted with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, TTI, and Lee Engineering was a sub-consultant for that work. We appreciated all the efforts that the team did for putting the information together. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike, and he can give some information about the team and then the findings of the study.
Well, thank you, Bill. I first want to also thank the Arizona Department of Transportation and Bill and the Technical Advisory Committee with ADOT for their guidance on this study. And I also want to give a lot of credit to Kay Fitzpatrick, who has done the original research that justified the pedestrian hybrid beacon based on an evaluation of like about 21 or 22 sites in Tucson that got it into the 2009 edition of the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, and then did a larger later study that looked and developed some crash modification factors for pedestrian hybrid beacons. And her team with Unsug Park and Michael Pratt at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Michelle and I were from Lee Engineering. Michelle has now gone on to another firm, but she was a wonderful help in this particular study. Now, pedestrian crashes over my career, over my 40-year career, have gone up. And it's very difficult and challenging when you have wide, high-speed streets with very high ADTs, and we need to find a way to get people across these streets. As I said, I installed the first 9 pedestrian hybrid beacons in Phoenix. The first 2 were under experimental before the 2009 edition of the manual came out. And we've been looking, I think now they have in the mid-60s, and they soon will be in the mid-90s, and just in the city of Phoenix. And they've been installed quite a bit all throughout the state. And Arizona has so many that have been installed that this is a really good opportunity to evaluate a high number of pedestrian hybrid beacons through a number of different type of applications throughout the state. The first question we wanted to ask on this study was, how do they work on higher speed roads? And you see this picture here is where this is actually one of 2 equestrian crossings in the city of Scottsdale, where it is in a very high speed, 50-mile-an-hour environment. And there are some agencies, when we actually started out, first of all, ADOT says nothing over 45. Of course, this is on a city street. There's another state actually had a maximum speed of 40. When we did a survey, we found out that 8 agencies said they would not use them on high-speed streets. 4 agencies said they would never consider them in rural areas, and 9 agencies said that they would not use PHBs under any circumstances. Now, when you look at the manual and uniform traffic control devices, there is nothing that limits the use based on speed. They actually have 2 nomographs. One is for, I believe it's greater than 35, and one is for less than 35 miles an hour or less. But there's no limitations on it. However, people have been reluctant to use them on higher speed streets because there hasn't been any research on it. Well, this is that research. For this particular study, we actually selected 10 sites. Now, one of the keys of having the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, or TTI, involved in the study is they conducted prior Federal Highway Administration studies. They actually did the video recording of behaviors at the locations for the Federal Highway Administration. And we were using similar, virtually the same type of data collection, which the data would be recorded on video, and then somebody would be sitting in a room evaluating it later on, just to make sure that they see for all these different items that we would want to look at. We're looking at driver yielding compliance, pedestrian compliance, and so on. And what are they doing with respect to the solid red versus the flashing red? Now, a goal of our study was to get as many of the of natural pedestrian crossings, pedestrian or bike crossings, that are out there, but for those locations where there was no one crossing at the time, that we were doing stage one of the team members that were out there setting up the cameras and monitoring the cameras and monitoring activities was actually used as a stage pedestrian, while the other person was actually looking for any unusual circumstances that were occurring in this study. There, at the beginning of the study, we were able to identify over 200 pedestrian hybrid beacons that were installed across the state of Arizona. Most of them that were in the Tucson metropolitan area, where they were first created by Dr. Richard Nassy. And a number of chunk were in the Phoenix metropolitan area, as well as throughout the state. We wanted to identify 10 higher speed locations where we would collect video data to be analyzed at the location. 2 of the locations are shown below on this screen of showing where they are, some in more rural areas and some in urban areas on higher speed streets. Like I say, the video data we collected, 100 crossings or 4 hours worth of data. And we tried to collect as many crossings as possible on that. Again, we evaluated the driver yielding compliance, the pedestrian and bike compliance, and I got the wrong way, that were done at the locations. This basically shows we selected 10 sites. 2 of them were state highways, 1 was a county road, and others were from different jurisdictions throughout the states and city jurisdictions. We thought when we selected them based on the Google Street View that we had all locations that had either a 45 or 50 mile an hour speed. We could not find any that were installed on streets that had a 55 mile an hour speed. We ended up having one that was actually on a 40 mile an hour street, but we later on found out that it was a good one to keep in our study. Many of the locations that we had were on multi-lane streets, so we got some wide streets in there. We had a couple of 2-lane streets that were part of the study. This is shows the distribution of the locations throughout the state of Arizona. The far northwest corner, the yellow pin, is in Bullhead City on a state highway. There are actually 5 pins in the Phoenix metropolitan area in the center of the state, 2 in the city of Scottsdale, 1 in Phoenix, 1 in Tempe, and 1 in Gilbert. There are 3 in the Tucson metropolitan area in the lower part of the state. There's 2 that were in the city and 1 was on the county highway. And there's 1 in the city of Sierra Vista on another state highway in the very southern portion of the state. This actually shows the speed limits versus the actual 85th percentile speeds. We asked the local agencies if they would contribute the speed data for the locations, and we got most of the locations, the agencies, to be able to provide that. Our video data collection was collected in April of 2018, and you'll see some of the data that was provided to us came from April or May of 2018. A couple of locations were historical, a couple of them were several years ago, but on locations that haven't really changed over the years. And you'll notice that one site that we had, TU89, had a 40 mile an hour posted speed limit, that's what PSL stands for. The 85th percentile speed, however, was 50 miles an hour. So it belonged as a part of our study. This is an example setup of a location that is installed at an intersection. Some of the locations were mid-block, some of them were at T intersections, and some were at 4-legged intersections like this, where the side streets would be local streets. When we did this, we would put the camera to be able to show both directions of travel and driver behavior for both directions on the main line street, which is Highway 95 in this case. And then we would put cameras on the side streets, either mount them on poles or put them in the dashboard of a parked vehicle along the side of the street to take a look at the interaction of those vehicles with the pedestrians that were crossing. This is an example showing, this is not our camera, but this is actually me taking a picture of one of our staged crossings. Notice the uniform that was used by our staged pedestrian, a gray t-shirt, blue jeans, a ball cap that was kind of subtle if they had it, and dark tennis shoes. so that they wouldn't stand out. And when we had a staged pedestrian crossing, where the person would wait until the traffic is moving freely, would go up and push the button as vehicles were approaching, and would wait for the walk signal to cross properly. The natural pedestrian crossings, we would actually not only looking at the driver behavior, but we were actually looking at the pedestrian behavior during those times of data collection. This is some of the results we have. We're going to kind of go into it. We'll be giving you a link at the very end for the full report, so you can get more of the details on it. As you can see, the driver yield rate when a pedestrian was crossing ranged from 93% at the low end, we had 2 at 93%, to 100% at the high end, for our 40 hours worth of data collection at these 10 various sites. You can see that the 2 sites that had the lower yielding rates were, well, one was in a rural area and one was in more of a built-up area near a canal crossing. Now, this is the compliance to the steady red and to the flashing red when there was no pedestrian actually in the crossing. The compliance was not as good, especially during the flashing red interval. The compliance was only 41%, but most of the compliance issues in that case, in fact, virtually every one of them, was a secondary driver who was required to pull up to the stop sign and stop before proceeding. And what they generally did was rolled through at a very low speed without coming to a complete stop. That was considered a violation. So those, in other words, we would have liked to see better driver behavior in terms of seeing them stop, but we never had a single instance at our location during our data collection when there was another pedestrian that would be coming at the time when it was flashing red. And obviously when it was flashing red, it was a countdown and a flashing don't walk. So the pedestrians were not supposed to be able to enter the street. Now this is a comparison of our study results, which is the ADOT study and the light blue, to a prior Federal Highway Administration study that was conducted on lower speed streets that were 30, 35, or 40. Now, the Federal Highway Administration study in red, their average compliance rate was 96%. Ours, in our study on higher speed streets, and notice the one at TU89 had was the 40-mile-an-hour street that had an 85th percentile of 50 miles an hour. We had an overall yield rate when pedestrians were crossing was 97%, slightly higher, but basically the same. And so based on these results, we had the same study, we had the same driver yielding rates, and we basically made a recommendation on this one that the pedestrian hybrid beacons should at least be allowed on 50-mile-an-hour streets. The 85th percentile speeds for the locations were between 44 and 54. So we had we saw no need to have any restrictions on at least streets up to 50 mile an hour, or actually 54 mile an hour when you look at the 85th percentile speeds. But further research can be looked at higher speed locations if those can be installed and looked at later on. The other issue that we wanted to look at was the safety. How safe are pedestrian hybrid beacons for motorists? And in this study, we had the unique ability to use a lot of locations, both for before and after and for long-term of what was going on. Prior research showed that not only was there a reduction of pedestrian crashes, but there was a reduction in total crashes, both in a FHWA study that was in 2010, an NCHRP study that was completed in 2017. But the numbers of locations that they had in those studies were relatively small compared to the number of locations we were able to use in our study. We did 2 different types of evaluations. One was an empirical base with a before and after. We had, I believe, 52 locations that had pedestrian hybrid beacons. And we had control sites that were nearby along the same arterial street. Some were signalized and some were unsignalized. We actually had 33 signalized and 98 unsignalized control sites where we looked at the crash data. We collected crash data. ADOT gave us 10.75 years worth of data. We looked at a before and after at the 52 sites and compared them with the uncontrolled or the signalized comparison sites, and used the empirical Bayes methodology to take a look at what is happening at those sites. And then we did a second study, a cross-sectional study, where we used 186 pedestrian hybrid beacons that were installed over the years. Now, for the before and after sites, those had to be installed between 2011 and 2015, so we can get the before crashes versus the after crashes. And we excluded 2 months before the pedestrian hybrid beacon was installed and 2 months after it. So we kept that change area out of the database. And those cross-sectional ones that we used, we made sure that in all cases, there had to be no roadway changes that occurred. Just the only difference would be the addition of the pedestrian hybrid beacon. So again, this kind of shows the number of locations that were identified at the beginning of our study. That was a couple of years ago. How many before and after sites that were installed between 2011 and 2015. 186 sites were used in the cross-sectional analysis, but some sites beyond that could not be used because of a various number of reasons. In our study, we found out that there was a 25% reduction in severe fatal and injury total crashes. These are not pedestrian crashes, but total crashes. So there would be a crash modification factor of 0.75. We had a 45% reduction in severe pedestrian-related crashes and a 29% reduction in severe rear-end crashes. So this was the findings that the pedestrian hybrid beacons were not only beneficial for pedestrian crashes, they had a positive effect on total crashes at the locations that we had studied. And this is from the before, after the empirical Bayes with comparison sites. For the cross-sectional study, some of the findings we had was no surprise that if you had, these are the 186 sites looking at up to 10.75 years worth of crash data. And I think we had like 1,056 site years of crash data in this study. If you have the more lanes on the major street, you're going to have more crashes. That's what kind of makes sense. And if you had more lanes on the cross streets, you're going to have more total and angled crashes. If there was a presence of a median, we found out that there were fewer crashes, which is similar to other studies in terms of pedestrian safety. We also found out if there was a bike lanes on the street, there was a tendency to have fewer pedestrian crashes at the location. And the spacing between the pedestrian hybrid beacon and the adjacent signals only became an issue for rear-end crashes, and only at the 0.1 level as a point, instead of 0.05. At the 90% level as opposed to the 95% level. We did find some of the key findings are that the mid-block locations there was no significant difference in crashes versus three-leg or four-legged intersections. Now you notice that when the manual came out in 2009, they had a guidance statement that they should not be installed at intersections. Arizona, in their supplement, took that out of the Arizona manual, but it's in for the majority of the other states. And our study justified that there is no significant difference between a mid-block location or an intersection location, in terms of the crash reductions and pedestrian safety. So that provides additional support for the installation at intersections and at mid-block locations. We also looked at speed in these things, and we characterized them at 35 or less versus 40 miles an hour or higher. And there was not a significant difference in crashes, except for rear-end crashes. And that really supported an additional support based on safety that we should include pedestrian hybrid beacons on higher speed roads. This is the link to the study. The study report came out in September of 2019. It has a lot more details in there, and I'm going to be talking after Mailén speaks about some of the recommendations for the design, installation, and some of the implementation, how this program should be implemented for different agencies. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike and Bill, for that presentation. That was excellent. We'll be able to circle back with some questions in a little while. For now, I'd like to turn things over for our next presentation to Mailén Pankiewicz. Mailén is the pedestrian safety coordinator for the city of Phoenix, overseeing the Office of Pedestrian Safety within the Street Transportation Department. The office utilizes a data-driven approach to develop and provide pedestrian safety education programs and campaigns, as well as infrastructure improvements. Mailén, I am seeing your screen now. Let me just check and make sure the slide is still up. It looks like it's thinking, spinning a bit.
Thinking.
But we've got you on audio, that's good.
Okay, 1 second.
No problem. Mike and Bill, while Mailén is working on pulling up that presentation, I wanted to ask a question that that came up. Mike, specific to the research methods, there were a lot of questions that came in about what is a staged pedestrian? What does that mean? I wonder if you could give just a quick description of how you use staged pedestrians in this and maybe other research. It's a method that some people may be familiar with, but I think it was a new topic for a lot of folks.
Yeah, basically it's a member of the project team who is in a uniform that is rather doesn't stand out, like I say, gray t-shirt, blue jeans on, that walks up to the pedestrian hybrid beacon, pushes the button as vehicles are approaching, so that these are fresh vehicles that hadn't stopped previously, making sure that no pedestrians are coming, that are natural ones, because we want to capture those first. But if there's no other pedestrians coming, that person, a member of the project team, would push the button and pay attention to the walk, flashing, don't walk, and cross the street in a normal manner. And that was what a staged pedestrian is compared to a natural pedestrian, which is just somebody that's on the street. And we also collected data from bicyclists too.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. I appreciate the clarification there. And as you were providing that answer, Mailén, it looks like we're all up and running and ready to go on your end. So whenever you're ready, please go right ahead.
Thanks, Dan. And hello, everyone. My name is Mailén Pankiewicz. I'm the Pedestrian Safety Coordinator for the City of Phoenix. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the City of Phoenix approach to PHBs. Granted that this approach is more related to planning, land use, and design of PHBs rather than the engineering considerations. But I think you'll find it useful to start thinking about this. So just like many cities throughout the country, Phoenix has also seen a great increase in pedestrian collisions. What you're seeing on the screen is the 3-year trends for pedestrian collisions. We've seen an increase in all injury levels, but the increase actually started back in 2014 for the city of Phoenix. So with this in mind, our city manager directed our street transportation department to create an office of pedestrian safety. And this office received $2 million worth of funding to create pedestrian safety improvements throughout all of Phoenix. So with this funding came a lot of questions about how do we prioritize the locations where we're going to be placing infrastructure, particularly PHBs, given that most of our serious and fatal collisions, which you can see in the heat map posted here, are happening in our arterial roads. And most of this funding, so right now, even though we get requests from communities and specific crossings, whether they want to reach schools, churches, and other places, right now we are focusing all of our efforts on our serious and fatal collision locations. So today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we look at the walking and crossing patterns at these high crash locations, how to design useful infrastructure to make sure that pedestrians are actually using the infrastructure rather than crossing without activating the button or crossing a few feet away from where our PHBs are, and Phoenix approach to educating the public on PHBs. And my apologies, here in Phoenix, we still call them hawks, and I'm sure during this presentation, I may say hawk a couple of times, so I hope that you can understand why that is. So to start the conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that is required prior to installing any kind of pedestrian infrastructure, and it's the fact that you probably want to get a good idea of your pedestrian traffic and your desire lines. And if you're not familiar with the term desire lines, which is really a planning term, I think the photo that you see on the screen is an excellent example of what a desire line is. Basically, it's the idea that us as humans, we have evolved in a way that we want to save energy, we want to do the shortest distance possible. And even wherever you're sitting right now listening to this webinar, if you look at any door that you may want to reach as you're sitting there, your brain will automatically plot the shortest distance from where you are to that door rather than going 2 times around a room to reach an entrance or an exit. And we see a lot of this desire line issue near our schools, near our grocery stores, multifamily developments, also high transit locations. Basically, all of our high pedestrian attractor and generators where people may want to reach a front door and they want to do it in the shortest way possible. And here in Phoenix, where we have such extreme temperatures for about 4 or 5 months out of the year, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees, we see many times that people are also trying to shorten those distances to avoid the extreme heat. So as a practitioner in this field, I hear a lot from our constituents, the public, even our elected officials. They say, well, pedestrians need to behave, they need to follow the rules that are in place for their safety, they need to actually use the infrastructure that we place for them. And I wanted to show you this example that you see on the screen because I'm sure it's something that all of us can relate. If you've ever been to an airport and you want to reach the front of the line, but they've set up one of those mazes that they set up to handle long lines, but there is no line there, the likelihood is that you will shorten that distance in a way that it probably doesn't involve you going through the whole empty maze to get to the front of the line. And when we talk about our pedestrians, many times we see that same behavior. And oftentimes people that walk the urban environment and they never had a safety issue occur to them related to traffic, it's almost like that behavior gets reinforced. And what happens in many of our urban environments, particularly as you move west in the country, is that we've set up our environments to accommodate vehicular traffic first, and then that human experience, so that human level second. And people are still operating at a human level in these environments that are assuming that people are moving in the same linear way as vehicles do. So I wanted you to keep this in mind to prime the conversation that we're having about how to design and place infrastructure in a way that will be useful. So in order to understand what it is to be a pedestrian, because many of us as practitioners may still use vehicles as a primary way to transport ourselves. So I put an example up here, and this is a 1/3 of a mile corridor between signalized location and the next signalized location. And this particular corridor not only is the highest pedestrian crash location here in the city, but it's also one of the highest in the state. So we knew that we wanted to be able to address this location with our pedestrian safety funding right away. But we're having a corridor that has a lot of those pedestrian attractors and generators, high density, high bus ridership. So whereas sometimes with just using engineering alone, we would say, well, 500 feet within or from the signalized location would be a good place to put this PHB. Phoenix approach was actually to place cameras, and you can see that where the 3 yellow dots are is where we place cameras to be able to gauge how people were using this segment of road, where they were heading, what they were trying to do. And we actually took 5 days worth of video in order to determine which of these locations would be best suited for the PHB. So again, rather than looking at a distance or an engineering standard only, we're looking at the actual behavior that we're seeing and how those land uses are affecting the way that people are crossing. And as you can see from our results, we find at the east location, where we actually have an existing RRFB, which doesn't seem to be very effective right now because it's a high-speed road with a lot of lanes on this road. But that would be the place where people are crossing most of the time. So it's a good way to assess where people are crossing and to get a good idea of whether or not, once you have the funding to implement a PHB, whether or not you're going to be putting it in a location that serves the majority of the people that need it. So with that in mind, I also wanted to talk about setting up your environments for success. And this has to do a lot with urban design, actually. We can all relate to those corner drugstores that we have throughout our cities. And if you look at the example on the first photo, we have an average drugstore where if a pedestrian wanted to use the existing infrastructure, granted it's not a PHB, but we can talk about a PHB example as well, and it's maybe 100 degrees outside, people are less likely to use the existing infrastructure because right now, the way that they need to access the site, even though the front door is right there, is to go around that retaining wall. And oftentimes what we see in our high crash locations is that folks are going for those driveways in order to enter the site because there is no pedestrian entrance. Again, we've developed our environments in many ways in a way to accommodate vehicles arriving to the site, but we never thought about how people would move through the site. Only we think about them how they will get to a front door once they get out of their vehicle. So on the bottom, you can see an example of a stipulation that we're starting to ask all of our developments that locating corners or even in areas where we predict we'll have a lot of pedestrian traffic back and forth, and is to provide an opening so that your infrastructure and your front doors are connected and we have the shortest possible distance between the two, and that tends to help with the behaviors that we see from pedestrians that many times we think are irrational or make no sense, or we don't understand why people are crossing such few feet away from something that's already there from the protection. But this is an excellent example of that, and one that can definitely be applied to PHBs as well. So this is a PHB we recently installed in Phoenix, east of our downtown. We had a high pedestrian generator on the right side of the screen that you see, and we also had a retaining wall. So as part of that budget to install this PHB, we also worked with the development next door to be able to provide an opening on that retaining wall to ensure that there is more of an intuitive flow to the walk that the pedestrian will have if they want to use the PHB, and it makes it more likely that they will use the PHB rather than going around it or rather than walking and then having to walk around a retaining wall. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how important that is for us here in Phoenix, where we have so many months of the year with extreme heat and also extreme sun. So that takes me to point number 4, which is how do we make sure that people stayed on our sidewalks and are actually led to the infrastructure so that they can use it. And something that we're also doing with our new developments as they come in is to actually ask for that separation between the road and the sidewalk. Sometimes asking for very thick landscape buffers really helps create almost an unconscious barrier for pedestrians that lead them to where you want them to go or to where you want them to cross. So providing shade for them so that they can be protected from the elements, or maybe in areas where it does rain, unlike here in Phoenix, providing some cover from the weather may also be useful. We actually had a situation, and unfortunately I didn't have the site plan with me, but we have a hospital that's located on both sides of a road where we're expecting to see a lot of high speed, and they wanted to pay themselves for a PHB, and they were figuring out how could they guide pedestrian traffic through the site in a good way, given that you have a very large setback with a lot of parking in between those two front doors. And the landscape buffer is something that we definitely recommended. So guiding pedestrians through a site, creating those barriers really helps lead them to where they want to go, particularly where you have a very ambiguous site or ambiguous land uses that may cause people to cross in places where you don't necessarily want them to cross. And to move on to point number 5, I wanted to talk about prioritizing equity. Something that we've seen here in Phoenix, we have $2 million worth of funding to provide pedestrian safety improvements. And what we find is that we have a lot of hotspots in the city where many of them look the same in terms of crash data. And what you're seeing on the screen is one of the hotspots within the city of Phoenix. This is a 0.4-mile corridor where in the span of 5 years, we've seen several pedestrian collisions of different levels of severity. And we did a study similar to the one that we did, to the one that I just showed you. And what came out of that study is the fact that we have 2 really high cross locations where we could be able to install a PHB. And what we do with the sites is actually to look at the income level of that population, to look at poverty levels, and also to look at the car ownership level. Obviously, because people that own no vehicles are more likely to use public transit and to walk to get to their destinations. So this particular corridor is one where about 60% of the households do not own a vehicle, and about 100% of the households are below the poverty line. And usually when we see census tracts of this kind, we usually see low access to food, which causes people to use public transit just to reach those daily uses, such as going to the store. So this is helpful because when we look at our elected officials, or where we look at our public and we explain that we have funding to be able to install PHBs, and we have several hundreds of miles of corridors in the city of Phoenix, and people are looking at us and asking us, how come you're investing so much in a quarter or less than a half-mile corridor? We can actually talk about that data. And keep in mind that when you have, even if you have census tracts that have 1 vehicle per household or so, when you have that low income level, where you have high poverty levels, people may be doing trade-offs. So if they want to afford food, they may forgo paying for gas for their vehicles. And even though we assume that vehicles are reliable because our own vehicles are reliable, in a lot of these high poverty areas, vehicles do not tend to be reliable, and they are actually, they become second to other needs that need to be paid for. So it's something that I wanted you to really think about when you have several locations that are in need of solutions. I wanted to also talk about working with your public transit authorities to discuss bus stop locations. And what I have here on the screen is about 500 feet where we've had in the past 5 years several collisions that have occurred in this 40-mile-per-hour corridor. This is an arterial road. We believe that what's causing a lot of these crossings is a convenience/liquor store that's open 24 hours a day on the south side of the road. And we have crossings that are happening at all times of the day, most of them happening at night. And our study that we did to look at pedestrian traffic decided that maybe the PHB should go here, leading the pedestrian straight to the front door of that convenience store. But with that, we realized that we had to move that bus stop because we don't want those bus stops to be behind, or to be, yes, behind the crosswalk. We actually want them to be ahead so that they're not causing a double threat issue of any kind. So as part of our budget, we also include some budget to move those bus stops to create the ADA compliance and the bus pads so that our pedestrians and our transit riders can have the best chance of using that PHB. And we often include some of the budget to be able to do that. And we run our 30% plans on PHBs through our transit agency to make sure that they approve of what we're proposing, so that they can propose a good solution to those bus stops. And now I wanted to switch gears to talk about the City of Phoenix approach to education. And what you're seeing on the screen is an example of a flyer that we send to our residents once we know that we have a location where we will be installing a PHB. And like I said, here in Phoenix, we still call them Hawks, so our flyer says Hawks. What I really like about this flyer is that we designed something that really explains the pedestrian perspective of using a Hawk and the driver perspective of using a Hawk. And most of the issues that we see with drivers in general is the fact that when you have that flashing red cycle, they don't know that they should stop, or they remain stopped even though there are no more pedestrians. So we include this part of the flyer as public information. We send this out to anyone within a quarter mile of where we'll have a new Hawk or PHB installation. And we often start sending them out once we have the underground work done for the Hawk. And if you wanted more information about PHBs, the link that you see on the screen, you can be guided to the City of Phoenix Street Transportation page, where we have this flyer and other useful information. We've also translated this flyer in Spanish, so we provided double-sided instructions on how to use the PHBs. And we've also went ahead and created education material for children. So as part of our pedestrian safety budget, we created a pedestrian safety activity book. And this book has several pages of pedestrian safety education, talking about many of the risk factors that we see in pedestrian safety, such as walking at night, crossing correctly, using public transit in a correct manner, not running after buses or trains and things like that. So you're seeing one of the pages of the book where we talk to kids about how to use our Hawks or our PHBs. We created a curriculum to go out to schools, and one of the classes that we teach is how to use Hawks appropriately. Kids are often surprised to find out that no matter how much they push the button, it's actually timed or coordinated with other signals. So they learn that nothing's broken if they're calling the button and it's not coming on right away. So they understand more about our traffic light systems, and that's always really exciting to go out to schools and be able to teach kids that. So you can actually find this pedestrian safety activity book in the link that I have provided at the bottom of the page. And I wanted to point out that because we have a high Spanish-speaking population, we've also translated the book into Spanish, and we're in the process of posting it online as well. And something that we really wanted to do in terms of this book was talk about how do people who have limited English interpret those signs and signals that we have on our roads, because no matter what, they're always going to come out and see them in English only. So we did little call outs throughout this book that has many illustrations of different regulatory and warning signs, so that they can understand what those signs really mean in their environment. So with that, that's all I have for you. And I hope I hear from you if you have any questions. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Mailén. That was wonderful. I love the focus on equity and some of the other considerations that you're incorporating into your planning. It's really forward-thinking and all-inclusive, which is really nice to see. I'm going to shift gears now and send the screen back over to Mike Cynecki, who's got another presentation to share with us. Mike, the screen's over on your end now, and it looks like you're nearly ready to go. Please go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
To get my mute off, but I have about 20 minutes. Is it okay for me to continue on and do this?
Yes, sounds great. If you have the availability, Mike, that'd be great.
Very good. This is a secondary part of the study that was done for the Arizona Department of Transportation on the design and the selection, design, and operation of PHBs that came from our research study. They wanted us to take a look at these things. Then they said to us, okay, now you've got these items. What are you going to? How should we take this information that you obtained? Again, the members of the research team. ADOT was a contracting agency. Kay Fitzpatrick led the project, and Mike Pratt and I also provided guidance on this one too. Again, ADOT has a guidance called TGP 640, and everyone that wants to look that up, it's a guidance on what to consider, and then how do you justify pedestrian hybrid beacons that's above and beyond the manual uniform traffic control devices. Now, I talked to the person who developed the TGP 640, and they said they did it based on what I had developed in Phoenix when I was there. And of course, what I developed was what Dick Nassie and Tucson had developed when they first went in, to try to identify appropriate locations and prioritize them. And in addition, they wanted some recommendations on some of the design and operations and an implementation plan. TGP 640, or TGP, stands for Traffic Engineering Guidelines and Processes. They basically have a point system to justify a pedestrian hybrid beacon or hawk. Again, Dick Nassie, when he developed the device, it was the device was supposed to be watching over the pedestrians like a hawk. And when the Federal Highway Administration adopted it, they said, well, we don't have any birds in the manual, so they gave it the name of pedestrian hybrid beacon. In addition to the point system for the different considerations, and I'll be going over what some of the considerations are, they have some additional concerns that planners or designers should look into. Are there any utility conflicts? Is right-of-way needed? Are there adjacent nearby crossing opportunities and signals? Is power available? And one of the things, the very first pedestrian hybrid beacon I installed in Phoenix, we already had the underground conduit there. It cost $52,000, but of that, $20,000 was just providing the power. Now, if you're in a rural area, you can imagine what the power costs may be. So there's a number of things that could be looked at. The evaluation sheet that the state of Arizona uses has, I got a dot point. It's hard to see, but if you can go on the internet and look up, just put in ADOT TGP 640, you'll come up with a 2-page document. The second page is their evaluation sheet. They look at pedestrian crashes for the prior 5 years, or the most recent 5 years, and 500 foot either side of the location. Peak hour crossing volume for pedestrians, the distance to the nearby crossing, posted speed limit. They have points for different posted speed limits, AADT, traffic volumes. You will actually have more points if you don't have an existing median, if you don't have illumination. They look at you, if it's a shared point, a path or a walkway or a trail crossing, you will have extra points, or if there's a pedestrian generator. And again, there's more points provided to it for wider street crossings. And again, if you get 35 or more, they justify it. But the nice thing about this procedure is, if you have multiple locations and you don't have money to fund multiple locations, well, you can use this to prioritize which one goes in first. So one of the things that we came out of our study, we made some recommendations to revise TGP 640. First of all, the old version said, no, you don't install them greater than 45. And we said, well, we can allow them with 50 based on our results. And then we wanted to fine tune some of the criteria that was in and some of the points that were assigned to this. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but some of the adjustments that we were made were done to based on some of the research that we had, and some of it was based on some existing guidance that's already out there. The very first thing that we tell people to do that in their steps to look at something is to consult the Arizona Step Guide, which is very similar to the Federal Highway Administration Step Guide. It's Arizona specific, and there's much more links. It's basically the same thing, but to take a look at other devices that may be out there, and not just be looking at only one device, but there may be other devices or a combination of other devices that could be used at a particular crossing. And for people across the country, I mean, the Federal Highway Administration Step Guide should be your very first step that you should be looking when you're evaluating a location to find out what is the most desirable to have in there, and what before you actually just made a decision that it's got to be a pedestrian hybrid beacon. we recommended as a part of our study that we should revise the points for the raised medians. And for those higher speed streets, 40 miles an hour or higher, instead of considering that a 6-foot median, the median's got to be 10-foot wide to be considered a raised median on it. And the reasoning is if you go stand out on a narrow 6-foot median at 40 mile an hour traffic, you don't feel comfortable there. We had some other recommendations to provide a guidance on what a pedestrian generator could consist of. We had some revisions of the crossing distances for the points assignment to be consistent with the AASHTO pedestrian design guide, which talked about a 60-foot distance or more should have some kind of a median in there. And we also added guidance about latent crossing demand. These are people who would cross if you had a good way to get them across the street. We recommended that they develop standard drawings for pedestrian hybrid beacons, so consultants or each division within the state, when they go to develop one, they will have something to start a starting point with. And we talked about, we recommended that they have a 15-foot wide crosswalk as opposed to the standard crosswalk, a ladder design, unless the crosswalk is going to be used for an equestrian crossing. Horses don't have good depth perception. They have a real problem with that. In those cases, you're going to have to use 2 parallel lines. But if it's otherwise, we recommend that they go with a high visibility or a continental or piano key design for this. And they already have a design of standard detail for the a mid-block crosswalk. And whether it's mid-block or intersections, we recommend it if you're going to do it with pedestrian hybrid beacons, other than those for equestrian crossings, they should be a ladder design. When this device was developed, it was developed to be installed on one side of the street, not on both sides of the street. You're not controlling the intersection, you're just controlling one crossing across it. This is a diagram that was actually made by Dick Massey when he developed the pedestrian hybrid beacon and guiding all the pedestrians and bicyclists, if there are any, to the other side of the street to where the device is and where the push button would be. We had recommendations of the advanced stop lines, some research that was done in the NCHRP study that I mentioned earlier. They have the advanced stop line and stop here on red at least 30 to 50 foot in advance of the crosswalk. But if you are using overhead mast arms, that you want to have the stop line at least 40 to 60 feet in advance of the mast arm. So when you're stopped at the stop line, you can actually see the overhead indications. And then the crosswalk stop on red, you notice this is the one in the Arizona manual of approved signs. It doesn't have the red ball on it. For the rest of the country, other states, you have to use if you're using the federal design, you have to have the red ball on the sign to be legal. This sign is currently required by the manual on uniform traffic control devices, the crosswalk stop on red sign with the red ball on it. The National Committee has recommended that in the next edition, it would be an optional sign, but currently, if you're going to install one, you have to have this sign and use whatever is required, either the federal manual or if you have your own state manual. One of the other issues associated with the pedestrian hybrid beacons that's been somewhat problematic is that people, when they see the flashing red, they remain stopped. This was a sign developed in Phoenix, and there's other versions of this sign. We recommended that the Arizona Manual of Approved Signs recommend a sign like this to install to remind drivers that once it's flashing, they can proceed when safe. And the fewer words you have on it, the better. This would be an optional sign, not a mandatory sign, but something that could be considered to allow the pedestrian hybrid beacon to operate and function more smoother. It's not a safety issue if a driver remains stopped. It's just a efficiency issue. Now, we recommended a standard drawing, and these are some of the things that we talked about in our standard drawings: is double-sided street lighting for wide streets. We talked about having, for higher speed streets, one pedestrian hybrid beacon face for each lane of through traffic. And that's similar to what the manual requires for higher speed streets. They said if it's 45 or higher, one signal head for each lane. We went on the conservative side and said if it's 40 or higher, we would recommend one overhead pedestrian hybrid beacon face per lane. Backplates, the ADOT standard drawing already has a reflectorized border around the backplate. That helps because this is not lit most of the time. It's when it's not in use, it is blank, and that helps drivers just recognize that the device is there. Optional warning signs, advanced warning signs. You can either do a pedestrian warning sign just for pedestrian crossing, bike and pedestrian if it's a trail crossing, or a school crossing sign. The minimum spacing, you can get it, we recommend it not going any closer than 300 feet based on the guidance in the manual on uniform traffic control devices. And for pedestrian detection, we recommended an APS push button, and that's something that's done in Phoenix ever since the very first one was started, accessible pedestrian signal push button. And consider optional passive detection devices for the pedestrians. This is actually an example from Phoenix where they not only have the push button, which is circled in red on the pole, but you notice they have an infrared detector, that's FLIR, F-L-I-R, that's a forward locating infrared that's used to detect pedestrians. And it's based on the change of the thermal temperature at the location. So that we have some crossings that are equestrian crossings where the horses actually don't want to get up close to the road, they get spooked. And we have some that are near Jewish synagogues where for religious holidays and the Sabbath, they're not allowed to actually use the push the button or create fire. And we worked out the Phoenix has worked out an agreement where they would put these in and it would detect the pedestrian standing back without having them to create it. And when it was used, the agreement was it would not give hot button service, but it would give just in sync with adjacent traffic signals. And microwave could be used, video could be used, so there's more than one technology, but that has worked well in the desert in Phoenix. Example for double-sided lighting, we get when you have utility conflicts. This is a street where you got overhead utility. I know we weren't allowed to get within 10 feet of an overhead wire. Well, this is a really good application showing how you have the lights on both sides of the street, and you put one at the very end of the mast arm. This is one of the equestrian crossings, so it doesn't have a ladder crossing crosswalk. It just has the two parallel lines, and it does also have the infrared detection for detecting equestrians and the detection area on either side of the street, so the horses do not get real close to the crossing. Other considerations that we recommended that they look at the two-stage crossings, and if you look on the picture on the right is the one that was done by Scottsdale, where they have a wide median island. This is a very popular crossing. The before, when they had no pedestrian crossing signs up there, it's located closely between two closely spaced lights, and people were still crossing. We had 23, and they actually detected 23 during the peak hour. After they put this two-stage crossing in, and it was done very, very well with fencing to corral them, and it was done with a single controller that operates both with APS push buttons. They actually had during the peak shopping season, they were recording up to 400 pedestrians per hour during the peak hours during the peak shopping season. There's two very popular shopping centers across. Now they synchronize them because they're very closely spaced signals, and they're real close to the signals both north and south of that one. But because it's two-stage, you can synchronize each direction independently. A very good application done by the city of Scottsdale. The left side is again a trail crossing, what's called a bike hawk. This is a pedestrian hybrid beacon that was set up for parallel crossings between bicyclists and pedestrians. They have their own push buttons, their own crossing areas. This happens to be at a very popular trail crossing in the city of Tucson, or a very high-speed road. And there are separate guidance or separate indications given to bicyclists and pedestrians. Now, the bicyclists have just like a bike's okay, and you could also just tell the bicyclists or put a sign that bikes must use pedestrian signals. So it just shows you an example that ADOT should provide some considerations for design, because they may have some trail crossings across state highways where this would be a good application. Our operational recommendations for the observation study we had earlier, I forgot to say that all of the locations that we had were hot button operations, that the default operation should be hot button to give better pedestrian service within 11 to 14 seconds. However, if during the peak hours for higher volume streets, we think that that should be synchronized, that it makes sense to synchronize, especially major arterial streets, and then go to hot button operation or evenings and weekends or the middle of the day. And if the spacing to a nearby signal is 600 feet or less, and there are some applications because pedestrians will not walk very far out of the way, that you should synchronize to nearby traffic signals if it's closely spaced, so that drivers don't get stopped twice going through an area. A driver that's stopped too many times may not always stop all those times. The flashing yellow for the operational recommendations, we recommended a flashing yellow of 4 to 6 seconds. When I was with Phoenix, we selected 5. That's just a standard duration of flashing time we had. Yellow duration should be the same as if you were calculating it for a traffic signal, no less than 3, no more than 6 seconds. Walk time, minimum walk should be 7 seconds. For those school areas, and we actually timed some when at school crossings, we gave it up to 10 or 11 seconds of the walk, where there was during the school crossing times, and then during the rest of the day, we had a walk time of 7 seconds. All red times, we actually saw some that had none, 1, 2, or 3 seconds, and we felt that there should be some all red between the start of the all red traffic signal and the walk signal, and we recommended 1 to 2 seconds. We saw a couple that had 3 seconds, and there was some kind of awkward movements at times that motorists didn't see pedestrians start walking in the street. Well, they haven't gotten the walk signal yet. 3 seconds was a little bit long, but 1 or 2 seconds was probably more appropriate based on our observations. And then there should also be a buffer at the end of the clearance. It doesn't say anything in the manual on uniform traffic control devices for pedestrian hybrid beacons, but if you look for pedestrian signals, you're supposed to have at least a 3-second clearance before the onset of the traffic. The Arizona supplement, when it was adopted, gave a 4 seconds of guidance for a 4-second clearance. And that 4 seconds can be contained within the pedestrian clearance interval. So it should count down to 0 4 seconds prior to the stop of the flashing red to give a clearance on the tail end of the crossing as well. Some additional operational recommendations. You shouldn't have to have subsequent actuations run right after the other for a pedestrian hybrid beacon. You need to have some vehicle time in between. So we recommended 30 to 60 seconds based on the street that's there. And we actually, when I was with Phoenix, had a shorter subsequent actuation time for school crossings during the school crossing hours, and had a longer, up to 60 seconds, during the non-school crossing times. There's things in Arizona called 15-mile-an-hour school zones. We recommended that this device not be done in conjunction with the lower, very low speed zones, because when you take away, when your pedestrian hybrid beacon or a hawk will come out and give you a 0 mile an hour, when you have the vehicle go time, if you made it really slow, you're going to create congestion and you're going to create angry drivers, and an angry driver is not a safe driver. So we said that they have to be mutually exclusive devices. A very slow zone for a school should not be used in conjunction with a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And if it's on a major arterial street, it's probably best to use a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And if there is a conflict that's detected, the devices have what's called MMUs that detect any kind of a conflict that's going on within the equipment. The pedestrian signal should go dark, and the vehicle flashes should go to yellow to let people know that it's not working properly, and so they can call the signal tech to actually do some repair. Then we gave some guidance on implementation. These are the 4 areas I'm going to cover for the implementation of how should the state take our recommendations. And they're now looking at these things. It's not saying that they're going to do it, but they're actually going to be looking at this for implementing throughout their agencies. First, we said that they review the TGB 640 for the design and selection and the Arizona manual of approved signs based on the recommendations that we have. And I understand there's a committee that's set up to do that now. Create new standard drawings for typical applications. They may be using an existing one that's done. That's right. We're going to use this as a standard drawing so that when others are going to be developed, that they will be developed in a very similar fashion, a similar design. Apply the new TGP 640 evaluation criteria when it's done to candidate sites that may have been rejected, and to see if they now would meet the criteria now that, for example, if it was a 50-mile-an-hour street on a state highway where they said they couldn't do it before, but if they adopt the 50-mile-an-hour, they may be able to put it in. And of course, develop a training program for ADOT staff and the consultants that are used to design the devices based on the Designing for Pedestrian Safety 201 courses. There may be Arizona specific. I'll give a plug for the Designing for Pedestrian Safety workshops that are being done by the Federal Highway Administration throughout the country, especially the focus cities and focus states. And develop case studies and handouts, and then present to the local COGs, the local ITEs, so that information can come out. Schedule training for ADOT staff and consultants, and then assess the existing pedestrian hybrid beacons on state highways that have already been done. If the recommended designs or the operational procedures, the operational features are different than what comes from the study or what is adopted by Arizona, take a look at making some changes in those things on a scheduled maintenance basis. If there are different devices to be used, let them weigh in for their service life. But when the service life is done, then update that to the current design. And then also review the pedestrian hybrid beacons that are currently under design, so that they get those design that's going to be in their final, the ultimate recommendations for the pedestrian hybrid beacons. And then also look at what's on the websites, and the states across the country should be looking at it. We looked and found that there was nothing, and even though Arizona was the first state to develop pedestrian hybrid beacons, there was nothing in the Arizona driver's license manual. There was nothing in the Arizona commercial driver's license manual regarding pedestrian hybrid beacons. So drivers, at least when they're studying to get their driver's license, should be introduced to these devices. And then there's things called questions, practice questions. We'll put some of the questions regarding the device either on the practice questions or in the actual questions in for the exams that people can study. And then 8, develop guidance to evaluate unique applications. Talked about earlier, latent crossing demand, 2-stage crossings, that Tucson has been using, and 3 other agencies across the country have been well, actually 2-stage crossings is one that I showed you. Tucson has some, but Scottsdale had one that I showed. The bike hawk is what Tucson is using, so develop guidelines for the application of those. And then develop a ranking program, again, for if you have more crossing locations that you'd like to put in and you have money, then those that would have the highest point total would obviously be the first one to be installed. So, and then for those that have been studied, to take a look at, and when it gets back to latent crossing demand, look at the effectiveness. Has there been a change in it? Is there some things that where you went from just a few crossings to a lot of crossings based on having the pedestrian hybrid beacon in place after one was installed? So again, this is the reference to the final report. You can get that free online, or if you can send me an email, I'll be happy to send you a PDF of the document, which was completed in September 2019. And that's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions, let me know.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for running through those recommendations. A lot of the questions that we got, I think you answered a lot of them in some of those operational recommendations and design recommendations. So that was very useful. We are, as I mentioned at the outset, what we're going to try to do is provide some written responses to some of the questions that came up instead of probably not tackling those in this session. But I did want to leave you all with a few resources. This account here, the email account, pbic@pedbikeinfo.org, is a great place to send some questions if you have them. We also have contact information here for each of our panelists. If you want to reach out to them directly, I think they'd be happy to share some of their thoughts on individual questions that you may have pertaining to these presentations or pedestrian hybrid beacons and their experiences. So please do follow up with them and with us. You probably are looking for a place where you can download a certificate of attendance for the webinar. That link is on this slide that I'm showing now. You may want to pause the video for a moment while you write down that link. and put it into your browser. If you visit that page, you can generate the certificate of attendance for this webinar. We are making this video available on our website, pedbicinfo.org/webinars, where we archive all of our episodes, where we also advertise the upcoming webinars that we're planning. So visit that page for more detail. We'll be updating the archive page with links to the report that Mike was talking about, with the step guidance, and a lot of other things that we've collected as part of this webinar. And I just want to say thank you again to our panelists for joining us today and recording these sessions. And I appreciate all of you for working through these technological issues and watching the end of this recorded session. We're glad we were able to find a way to get this information out to you all. So thank you very much, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.